Welcome to U.S. History 2202, Section 10. This is Professor James Cement, and this is Week 4, Immigration and Urbanization in Late 19th Century and Early 20th Century America.
What is your name? Come on, son. What is your name?
Tuo nome? Vito Andolini from Corleone.
Corleone. Vito Corleone. Okay. Over there. Next. Your name.
Tell him he has smallpox, quarantine 3 months.
Il dottore ha detto che hai il vaiolo, devi andare per 3 mesi in quarantena all'isola Ellis.
Vito Corleone.
There he is. This is him.
What you have just been watching is a Italian immigration in the early 20th century. This is not obviously original film from that period. The clarity of the film technology at that time did not have the ability to achieve this kind of clarity, never mind color, or for that matter, sound. It is a Hollywood recreation. Perhaps it's a movie you've seen. It was an Academy Award winner in, I believe, 1974. The name of the child might give it away. I'll tell you what that film is after I make a few comments about what you've just seen. What I like about this particular film clip is the detail, the attention to detail that the director put into this scene of these Italian immigrants coming in. You'll notice for a couple of small little things. For example, you'll notice that the or you might not notice, but the immigration official who briefly interviews him speaks with an Irish accent, indicating sort of an earlier wave of immigration that had been assimilated into America. You'll notice that the boy is given a new name based on the village in which he comes from. This happened to many immigrants in this period. They were given new names based on their origin or their occupation. And many people who came during this period can trace their names not to their old country, but to their experiences in the immigration process. The other thing I think it captures, or the bigger message that it captures, is just the sheer volume of immigration coming in, and that America had begun to, with the establishment of Ellis Island and other immigration stations in the early part of the 19th century, in the late part of the 19th century, had begun to sort of create institutions, facilities, and a bureaucracy to handle just the sheer number of immigrants coming in during this period. Finally, I think you also notice that there was a number of inspections of the boy. If he had been adult, he also would have been interviewed to find out if he had had a criminal past or had any kind of radical political ideologies, as we talked about before. In this case, he is quarantined. They don't explain in this film why he's being quarantined, but his skinny little body might have triggered concerns that he suffered from tuberculosis. And so he was quarantined for a time to make sure that he didn't have it. And then, of course, he is released. So, what's the film? Of course, the Vito Corleone. For those of you who are fans of the Godfather films, will recognize the name of the founder of the Corleone crime family that is at the heart of the Godfather film and this film, Godfather Part 2. To recap what we've talked about earlier in this week, on Monday we examined the immigration of the 1870s through 1924, the great wave of immigration that came to America in that period. We looked at where people were. We looked, first of all, at the sheer volume of people coming in. As you can see from this chart, it expanded dramatically in this period. Second, we looked at where immigrants were coming from during this period and the shift from Northern and Western Europe to Southern and Eastern Europe. We also took a look at the numbers of at why people were coming, and we examined things like persecution, war and civil unrest. But we focus mostly on the cause of the masses of immigration, and that is economic dislocation caused in many cases by the commercialization of agriculture in many traditional regions, like southern Italy in the late 19th century, and like Mexico in the late 20th century, that produced mass waves of immigration as farmers on the land find themselves made redundant by the commercialization of agriculture. On Wednesday, we examined how they adjusted to life in America. We took a look at settlement patterns, why certain groups of immigrants ended up going to rural areas. Those immigrants with a certain amount of capital and English language abilities able to make their way in American society, integrate themselves more quickly. We talked about some of the occupations that immigrants went into and how certain immigrant groups ended up going into certain branches of industry and other immigrant groups going into other branches of industry. Oftentimes this had to do with not sort of an innate interest in that industry, but the fact that earlier immigrants from that same immigrant group had drifted into that industry and then sent word back about jobs and opportunities in a particular industry. And so that you saw people, for example, like Polish and many East European immigrants ending up working in the heavy industries of the Midwest or in coal mining in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, and how many Italian and Jewish immigrants concentrated themselves in cities and went to work in sweatshops in the rising garment industry in the late 19th, early 20th century. This was a rising business as people turned to ready-made clothes in stores rather than making them themselves. We also discussed the phenomena of immigrant ghettos in many northeastern and midwestern cities, how immigrants tended to settle in neighborhoods where they could speak their own language, buy familiar foods, worship in their own churches and synagogues. And so these immigrant ghettos grew up in many urban centers. We also examined the urban landscape in which many of these immigrants found themselves. Things like amusement parks, vaudeville theaters, and later movie theaters, spectator sports, the neon lights of Times Square and other urban centers. Various forms of recreation and entertainment that allowed immigrant communities, particularly younger immigrants, to begin to find their way in American life, to become assimilated to American life. Where they became introduced in places like department stores to American abundance and American consumerism. We also examined how immigrants integrated themselves into America's political system, largely in many cases through urban political machines like that of Tammany Hall in New York City, where the political machines offered a kind of primitive and informal welfare system to allow immigrants to survive economically in an environment in which they had low-paying jobs and crowded housing, in exchange for votes and contributions to the political machine, so that it, in turn, could benefit itself and its political leaders. If you recall from the very first lecture on Monday at the very beginning, I said that we were going to cover four things in our discussion of immigration and urbanization in late 19th century and early 20th century America. We were going to look at why immigrants were coming to the United States in such large numbers during this period. We were going to talk about how they came to America. We were going to look at the process by which they integrated themselves into American life, the lives that they created for themselves in America. And finally, we're going to look at, and what we're going to take a look at in this lecture today, is the reaction of native-born Americans. And as I said earlier, what we mean by native-born Americans are people, of course, who were born in the United States, maybe have been here for a couple of generations. And so we're going to look at how they responded to this massive wave of immigration in this period. And not just the sheer numbers of immigrants, the sheer volume, the millions and millions of people pouring to the shores, but who these immigrants were, where they came from, and how native-born Americans perceived these immigrants and their nations of origin. There were basically two responses, to perhaps oversimplify things, to this massive wave of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century by native-born Americans. One approach was to welcome them into the country, but to try to get them to assimilate as quickly as possible into the American way of life. The other, which we'll get to later on in the lecture, was exclusion, trying to keep them out for fear that they were undermining American institution, undermining American values, and undermining the American way of life. But we're going to begin with those who advocated for an assimilation process that said, we welcome these immigrants into America, but we need to turn them into Americans as quickly as possible. Otherwise, again, we might undermine American values and the American way of life, and also that the immigrants needed to assimilate if they were going to be successful in their new country. But within this assimilationist approach to immigration, there were kind of two different approaches. One was what we might call the soft approach. And that soft approach was personified by this woman, Jane Addams, and others like her. Jane Addams came from a family, a well-off upper-middle-class family in Chicago. Her family traced its origins in the United States back hundreds of years. She was of old English stock. She was, and this is rare for the day, college-educated woman. And she decided to devote herself in life to trying to help alleviate some of the problems experienced by impoverished Americans. And in her day, in the late 19th, early 20th century, what most of those impoverished Americans shared was an immigrant background. And Jane Addams was part of an entire class of sort of liberal thinking, college-educated progressives Indeed, the era we're going to talk about next week is called the Progressive Era, based on this shared principles that these people had. Like many others of her generation, Jane Addams believed that since she was born to privilege, she needed to serve her country and a larger cause. In her case, that was helping impoverished immigrants succeed in their. Jane Addams is best known for her establishment of the Hull House Settlement House in Chicago. As we discussed earlier, we talked about the political integration of immigrants into American life and their involvement in political machines. There was very little in the way of government welfare at this time. There was no government support for people who were unemployed. There was no government support for people trying to better themselves economically. And so philanthropists like Jane Addams established these things called settlement houses. Settlement houses were scattered across urban neighborhoods across America in places like Chicago and New York and San Francisco and Pittsburgh and other places where there were large concentrations of newly arrived immigrants. And in these settlement houses, immigrants were given all kinds of aid. There were English language classes, there were cooking classes. Here's an example of one of those cooking classes. They were basically machines for trying to assimilate immigrants. Now, Jane Addams herself was rather liberal on this score and believed that immigrants should retain certain elements of their native culture for matters of pride and for matters of dignity. She felt it was important that they retain some of their old customs and their old ways and their old habits. She believed that a diverse America was a good place. But primarily what she believed in, and other people like her who established these settlement houses that served millions of immigrants over the decades, was that they must assimilate into the American way of life, that they had come to America to be part of America. And there was also a certain underlying paternalism or approach, and that is that the American way of life was superior to their way of life. And for example, here you see a class of immigrant girls being taught to cook the American style because it's seen as more hygienic American style of cooking. It's seen as healthier than the immigrant forms of cooking. So there's kind of this paternalist sort of looking down at immigrant culture's approach. Also, of course, it's very gender biased. As you can see, it's only girls in this cooking class because at that time, a woman's place was, of course, in the home, in the kitchen. And settlement houses did not try to challenge those gender identities at that time. But again, the settlement house was primarily to assimilate them. But of course, it was a voluntary institution. Immigrants chose to come to the settlement house. They chose to attend these classes on cooking, on English language, and on learning American customs and practices, and learning about the American political system, about learning about the American Constitution, and even about ways to dress American style, all of which the immigrants wanted to absorb because they wanted to assimilate. And from the perspective of the settlement house workers, this was considered a way to improve the lives of immigrants because the American way of life was seen as superior. There was also a more coercive form of this assimilation process, probably best represented by Henry Ford. Henry Ford, of course, is most famous for having developed the assembly line system, for founding Ford Motor Company, and for making the Model T and other early cars that, for the first time through mass assembly, put the price of automobile within the reach of working and middle-class Americans. Prior to, of course, to Ford's assembly line, automobiles were primarily toys for the rich. Now, Ford's factories sucked in thousands upon thousands of unskilled laborers. The assembly line, of course, allowed people with very little skills to be able to be integrated into factory production because basically they were going to be doing the same small work process over and over and over again, and it did not take a lot of skill to learn how to do it. And so his factories absorbed thousands upon thousands upon thousands of unskilled factory workers, many of whom, of course, were immigrants. But the monotonous nature of assembly line production presented Ford with a problem, and the problem was that it burned out workers. Working 12 hours a day doing the same task over and over again in a noisy and dirty factory basically led to extremely high turnover in his factories, at something like 100% every year. In other words, he was having to bring in a new worker every year to replace one that was leaving. And to address this problem, in 1913, Ford offered what was then an unprecedented wage of $5 a day. Ford believed, and quite rightly, that by paying workers a higher wage, $5 a day, that he would be able to retain workers better and lower the numbers of the high volume of turnover that he was experiencing in his factories, which was, of course, undermining productivity and profits. Now, in offering this $5 a day wage, Ford also argued, of course, that he wanted to pay his workers enough that they could buy the automobiles that they were making. But the $5 a day wage came with a bit of a catch, and that was that Ford expected his workers to live by standards that he believed they should live by. And those standards, of course, as with many native-born Americans like Ford, was that the immigrants had to assimilate themselves into the American way of life. He wanted to make sure that his workers were, of course, up to the job, and he believed that the American way of life would allow them to be more productive workers. But he also thought that they had to give up their immigrant ways if they were going to succeed in America. And so Ford established what he called the social department at Ford Motor Company, in which he hired hundreds of social workers. People like Jane Addams, for example, who wanted to improve the lives of immigrant workers. But what he set up, the system that he set up, which called Fordism, worked like this. Inspectors if you went to work in a Ford factory, basically you agreed to the idea that these social workers or inspectors could come into your home at any time. They could come in basically on a moment's notice. They didn't have to give you an announcement in advance, and they would come into your home and they were allowed to look everywhere they wanted to look. They could look in your they could look in the pantries of your kitchen to make sure there was the right kind of food in there. They could look into your home to make sure that it was kept clean and up to standards that Ford believed you should maintain in your home. To make sure that your kids were in school and not working at home. To make sure, of course, that there was no alcohol in your home. This was a kind of coercive assimilation process that Ford introduced. For the most part, Ford was accepting of immigrants. You know, after all, he had to be. They were the major cohort of workers in his factories. But he definitely believed that they had to assimilate as soon as possible into the American way of life, and that they really had no choice. But deep down, Ford believed that with the proper amount of oversight and the proper amount of direction and even the proper amount of coercion, they could be turned into good Americans over a certain period of time, particularly their children, who Ford encouraged to go to public school, as opposed to parochial schools, Catholic schools, where he believed that they would be being indoctrinated with foreign ideas. In fact, the public school movement in this period, this was a time when public schools were spreading across urban America, and a large part of this movement of public schools in late 19th and early 20th century was to get children into schools where they could be Americanized, as opposed to parochial and Catholic schools run by churches and other groups that might have more foreign influence and that might help the immigrants retain their foreign culture. The idea of public schools was to assimilate these immigrant children into the American way of life. And back to Ford, of course. So he believed that immigrants could be fully integrated into American life. He did have a certain problem, of course, with anti-Semitism. He was deeply hostile to Jewish immigrants and believed that they represented a foreign threat within the body American, and he subscribed to some pretty ugly anti-Semitic stereotypes and ideas in his lifetime. But aside from that, and that's a big aside, of course, he, as I said before, he welcomed immigrants into America, but believed they had to assimilate and become Americanized as quickly and as soon as possible, and as thoroughly as possible. And the idea of assimilating immigrants into the American way of life speaks to a deeper issue that was prevalent among liberal thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th century. Something we'll be talking about next week when we talk about the Progressive Era, which overlaps with this period of massive immigration. And that is that people are basically capable of being reformed and changed. That there's not something inherent in their nature that makes it impossible for them not to improve their condition, which, of course, from the perspective of native-born Americans, means becoming Americanized, becoming American. Then, in a sense, the problem that immigrants have and the reason why they need to be assimilated is because they come from a culture that doesn't really fully understand the democratic way of life in America, that doesn't fully understand American freedoms, that doesn't understand American free enterprise, but that they can be changed, that they can learn how to do this. They can learn to participate, that there's not something inherent in who they are that prevents them from doing this, that this culture, that there is the possibility of changing their culture. But there was another strain of thought within the native-born American population, and that was there was a rising sentiment that there were just too many immigrants coming in, period. And more importantly, they were the wrong kind of immigrants. And to understand what this meant, what we mean by the wrong kind of immigrants, we have to understand the general culture of the time concerning ethnicity. Take the question of race. We talked about this early on when dealing with Reconstruction, and I want to revisit this now. In the late 19th century, there was among many native-born Americans the attitude that physical origins very much determined what kind of person you were. It was a pseudoscience, a fake science, but we now realize that now from all kinds of research that's been done since that the differences among races is absolutely minimal, the inherent differences among races. But at the time, they were seen as very, very important. It was a pseudoscientific idea that physical characteristics of the person very much determined the propensities and capabilities of the person. And so that certain things that we would now characterize as cultural aspects of a person were seen as actually being determined by inherent genetics, although of course they didn't understand genetics at the time, but were inherent in their nature. That they were not just cultural, part of their cultural baggage, but were inherent in who they were as a person. What ethnicity and race belonged to determined who they actually were. And by that measure, of course, these different groups could not be assimilated into American life because they were of a stock of people that were just incapable of grasping the higher values, as a native-born American saw it, of the American way of life, democracy, free enterprise, Protestant Christianity, and the like. And so assimilation was a dead end. It wasn't going to work with these people. They were never going to become fully Americanized. We also have to understand that race was seen a bit differently then than it is now. Yes, there was a recognition of a white race and a black race, as there is today, and there was a great deal of hostility, of course, towards Mexican immigrants and other people of different skin colors than white Americans. Mexicans, for example, were seen as mixed race, and that therefore made them inferior. Asians were seen as coming from a stock of people that were willing to live at standards way below that of a good American white worker. And so there were racist attitudes that were based on ideas of race that we might in terms of what we would define as racist today. But there was also this idea that various ethnic groups represented certain kinds represented various races in a way. That there were gradations, for example, even within the Caucasian race, so that people of Slavic or East European background were of a kind of separate racial ethnicity than Northern and Western Europeans of British or German descent. Similar that Italians or Mediterranean types were of a distinct ethno-racial group that was different from and inferior to Northern and Western Europeans. You can see in this chart sort of an example of what I'm talking about. Of course, they include an African American, but they also include, as you'll notice here, an Irish American. And you'll notice that the distinctive characteristic of this is the shape of the skull. And so with this pseudoscientific idea, you'll see that the Anglo-Teutonic, the person of British or German ancestry, has a much higher forehead, indicating a much greater cranial capacity and therefore a larger brain than either the Irish immigrant to the left or, of course, the African American to the right. It's all, of course, complete nonsense. There's nothing to do with cranial capacity. No group has larger cranial capacity. Cranial capacity has nothing to do with brain size. Brain size has nothing to do with intelligence per se. And so it was all kind of nonsense. But it was taken very seriously at the the time, and it was believed to actually explain why various ethnic groups were the way they were, and it also justified excluding them because they were incapable of rising to the level of the American way of life. They were incapable intellectually, they were incapable literally physically of rising to that standard. This was part of what we had talked about a couple of weeks ago when we talked about social Darwinism, that there were certain races that were better adapted to the modern way of life. It was also a time when there was a strong belief in eugenics, that society, government, should try to encourage higher birth rates and more babies from supposedly more superior ethno-racial groups, again, from origins from Northern and Western Europe, and to discourage reproduction or birth rates among Eastern and Southern Europeans and other inferior ethno-racial groups. Even a progressive liberal like Margaret Sanger came to sometimes believe in some of these pseudoscientific ideas of eugenics. Margaret Sanger, of course, is famous for her advocacy for birth control and as the founder of Planned Parenthood. And Margaret Sanger was believed in birth control because she saw the hardships that many women face, particularly many immigrant women face, by having to having to give birth over and over again, and extremely large families. She believed in a progressive liberal way that this kind of kept women down and also kept them impoverished. And so she sought to make birth control more available to working women, to poor women, so that they could avoid the hardships of having these very, very large families, and to give women a certain amount of power over their own reproductive lives, something that we would agree is sort of a progressive liberal cause. But she also believed, in part, that we needed to extend birth control so that those people who were not of the highest quality would reproduce and produce persons of lower quality. And so part of what the eugenics movement was about was also preventing people that were seen as having physical propensities towards criminality, or to being mentally less capable, mentally deficient, would not breed and pass on their genes to others. Now, this whole eugenics idea was quite widespread in the Western world, not just in the United States, but in England and Europe, as well in the early part of the 20th century, and was taken to absolute extremes, of course, by the Nazis in Europe, the Nazis in Germany before and during World War II, and their grotesque efforts at preventing, at utilizing what they considered to be inferior races and experimenting on them, and and of course exterminating what the Nazis saw as inferior races in the hopes of breeding a superior Aryan race of Germans. And because of that, the extreme barbarity of the Nazi regime, eugenics fell into disfavor after World War II. But it was quite widespread in the early part of the 20th century and here in the United States. But getting back to the immigrant question, so if you accept this idea, as many native-born Americans in this period did, that these masses of immigrants coming from what were considered to be inferior cultures, inferior ethno-racial groups, such as the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, Jewish peoples from Eastern Europe and Russia, as well as Southern Europeans from places like Italy and Greece, then obviously the conclusion you would draw is that we need to keep them out. We need to prevent them from flooding America with masses of literally physically inferior people, intellectually inferior people. And there was also the belief that many of these people, because they came from inferior ethno-racial groups or inferior cultures, they were susceptible to un-American ideas, to foreign ideas, such as political radicalism, and to being obedient slaves of the Catholic Church. There was a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice in this period. The Catholic Church was seen as a religion that encouraged obedience, that parishioners and members of the Catholic Church blindly and obediently followed priests and ultimately the Pope in Rome. And this ran against ideas of American ideas, native-born American ideas of free thought and democracy and thinking for oneself and free enterprise and all that sort of thing. And so there were those who believed that we needed to exclude those people who came from inferior cultures. One of the leading proponents of this eugenics idea, this ethno-racial idea, was a man named Madison Grant. He was of very old English stock. His family had been in America for centuries. He was upper middle class from New York. He became a high-priced corporate lawyer, but he also was he was also an active conservationist and environmentalist of the early 20th century, and was a amateur zoologist who helped found the Bronx Zoo, still today one of the leading zoos in America. But Madison strongly believed, perhaps because he was studying other species, that human beings were divided into races based on very strong physical attributes that could not be changed through the assimilation process. He very much argued against the idea that immigrant peoples could be, that these inferior immigrant peoples from Eastern and Southern Europe could be integrated into the American way of life. And he was very much antipathetic or hostile to the very idea of what he, of miscegenation. And of course, we usually think of miscegenation as miscegenation among different races, blacks and whites or Asians and other groups that we recognize as races today. But in his time, what he meant was miscegenation even among different branches of the Caucasian race. He felt that that inevitably the inferior genes of, say, an Italian bred with the superior genes of a Northern or Western European, like a German or somebody from the United Kingdom, would inevitably lead to a child with inferior genetic attributes. Again, it's all complete nonsense pseudoscience as we understand it today, but it was a very powerful idea in early 20th century America, even within the scientific community of the day. And Madison Grant was a popular proponent. His books sold well among sort of the influential people in America. He was kind of a popularizer of this eugenics idea, as in his book, The Passing of the Great Race, which I had you read an excerpt from this week. You can see his ideas on eugenics in the quote above. Race feeling may be called prejudice by those whose careers are cramped by it, but it is a natural antipathy which serves to maintain the purity of type. In other words, he's saying, there are those people who believe in assimilation and believe that it's possible, are so caught up by their own feelings that that assimilation is possible, that these people from these inferior ethno-racial groups can be integrated into the American life, that they are blinded to the fact that scientifically, according to his ideas of science, this was not possible. And he goes on to praise, as you can see here, he goes on to praise the very idea of prejudice. The unfortunate fact that nearly all species of men interbreed freely leaves us no choice in the matter. Either the races must be kept apart by artificial devices of this sort, or else they ultimately amalgamate, that is, breed together, and form mixed race people. Again, race defined as ethno-racial, not necessarily by skin type. And in the offspring, the more generalized or lower type prevails. And in the second quote that you see here, he writes, the European governments took the opportunity to unload upon careless, wealthy, and hospitable America the sweepings of their jails and asylums. The result was that the new immigration, while it still included many strong elements from the north of Europe, as we saw in our immigration charts earlier, there were still large numbers of people coming from the United Kingdom, coming from Germany, contained a large and increasing number of the weak, the broken, and the mentally crippled of all races drawn from the lowest stratum of the Mediterranean basin and the Balkans. Balkans are an area in southeastern Europe where many immigrants were coming in from, together with hordes of the wretched, submerged population of the Polish ghettos. And of course there he is referring to Jews, East European Jews. And so what he's talking about here is not just that America is being inundated immigrants from cultures and ethno-racial groups that are inferior to Northern and Western Europeans that have predominated among the American population during its first 100 years. That not only that, but that these countries, that the members of the immigrants from these countries in Eastern and Southern Europe are actually the lowest classes of those Eastern and European nations. But of course, we can see from this quote that he is completely misunderstanding the immigration process. European governments are not sending these people. These people are coming on their own. They're coming on their own initiative. And for those of you who are familiar with today's political dialogue, of course, you recognize an echo in some of what Donald Trump has to say about immigration today. Donald Trump also talks about these various countries, these various governments overseas, in this case he means, of course, Mexico, Central America, and places like that, are sending their worst people. They're sending their criminals, and they're sending their rapists and that sort of thing. Again, completely misrepresenting the immigration process, because the vast, vast, vast majority of immigrants come under their own initiative. They come on their own dime. They come under their own initiative. They're not being sent by governments. But that's what Madison Grant is talking about here. That it's some kind of plot against America, and that America is stupid, and America's leaders are ignorant, and America's leaders are weak, and they're allowing all these inferior people to come in. Again, we're seeing echoes of that today. Not surprisingly, both periods are marked by masses of immigration from places that traditionally had not sent many immigrants before. And so what Madison Grant is responding to is this idea that American culture was changing under his feet, and that the predominant northern and western values, or as he saw the northern and western values of democracy and free enterprise and free thinking, were being undermined by these inferior peoples coming in. And that if America wasn't careful, it would be forever changed for the worse. Again, echoes of it today. Anxiety among the native-born population that the America they grew up in and believed that they knew is changing around them, and they don't like those kind of changes. Now, Madison Grant basically wrote his books for elites, but this sentiment was also growing among the masses of America, among ordinary people who might not read these supposed works of science and sort of high nonfiction literature. And we see that sentiment among ordinary working native-born Americans in the refounding and the growth of the Ku Klux Klan. You can see them here marching down Pennsylvania Avenue quite openly, without masks over their faces, in the early 1920s, a time when America was trending towards immigration exclusion. But before we get to the the legal exclusion of immigrants, which we're going to talk about at the end of today's lecture, we should talk about this Ku Klux Klan movement. Now, unlike the Ku Klux Klan of the 1860s, which was primarily aimed at African Americans and preventing them from achieving economic and political equality, social equality within the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction South, the Ku Klux Klan that was refounded in 1950 was primarily located in the North. It had branches, of course, in the South, but it was primarily a phenomena of the northeastern states, of the Midwestern states, and even of Western states like California. There was a major Ku Klux Klan. The other thing about the Ku Klux Klan in this period, that was founded in 1915 and existed into the 1920s until a series of internal scandals and financial scandals brought it down, was that it was a mass movement. There were millions and millions of people joining the Ku Klux Klan, and these were people from all kinds of walks of life. There were working people, there were professional peoples, there were politicians. Many for example, the Ku Klux Klan was particularly powerful in the state of Indiana, where a majority of the members of the state legislature and the governor were open members of the Ku Klux Klan. It was even rumored that the President of the United States in the early 1920s, President Warren Harding, was actually a secret member of the Ku Klux Klan, though that's never been confirmed. The Ku Klux Klan was seen as respectable. It was seen as a pro-American, all-American, patriotic organization. But its main goal, but it was still an organization based on hate, as it had been in the 1860s towards African Americans. But in this case, the hate was not directed so much towards African Americans, because in the early 20th century, in the 1910s and 1920s, when the Ku Klux Klan and its reincarnation reached its peak, basically the racist Jim Crow regime was fully in place in the South, and it was not being widely challenged by African Americans, and so there was no need for a Ku Klux Klan type organization to rise up to suppress African Americans, because the segregation system and the disenfranchisement system had already fully taken root. Instead, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1910s and 20s was aimed at foreigners. It was particularly hostile towards these new immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe, and it was particularly hostile towards immigrants of Catholic background and immigrants of Jewish background. This hostility towards these immigrants of Catholic and Jewish background from Eastern and Southern Europe was exemplified in two very high-profile trials, two high-profile criminal cases and trials of the. One of these trials concerned two Italian immigrants by the names of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti of Boston. In 1920, there had been a robbery at a shoe company in which a guard and a paymaster had been murdered, and these two men were arrested for the crime. Both of these men were political radicals. They belonged to a political faction known as the anarchists, who believed that, basically they were radical political activists who believed that, capitalist government was oppressive and needed to be overthrown and replaced. And this political background, but more importantly their Italian background, led many to assume that they were guilty of this crime. And what happened was that the trial went on for a couple of years, went on for a while, and it became kind of a political sensation that divided Americans. Many anti-immigrant types believed that they were absolutely guilty, but in fact, subsequent investigations of what happened, and even investigations at the time, indicate that they may have been framed. But the point was, and many liberal Americans rose up in their defense, and it even became an international issue, with many countries, including Italy, trying to prevent them from being executed. They were ultimately executed in 1927 for the crime of murder. But it divided Americans about immigration, and about Italian immigration in particular, and about Italian propensity to crime as it was seen at the time. And so this trial captured the attention of many Americans, captured the imagination of many Americans, and indicated in what many liberal Americans at the time saw as their sort of being railroaded and being framed for this crime and ultimately being executed. This was an example of the kind of anti-immigrant prejudice of the. The other high-profile crime that I'm referring to has to do with a Jewish immigrant by the name of Leo Frank. It took place in a small city in Georgia known as Marietta. Leo Frank was of Jewish origin. He lived in Atlanta, which Marietta was kind of a suburb of Marietta, Georgia. And he was a superintendent in this pencil factory. And in 1913, this young woman, Mary Fagan, was working in the pencil factory, and she was raped and murdered. And the fingers were immediately pointed at Leo Frank as the perpetrator of this crime. Once again, evidence did not conclusively link him to the crime, but he was nevertheless tried and convicted. But the evidence was circumstantial and was questioned by many people who observed the trial. And of course, Leo Frank and his lawyers decided to appeal the case. And ultimately, through the appeals process, it was decided that Frank's that the death sentence that had been given to Frank should be commuted to a sentence of life imprisonment. This angered many Georgians, many people in that community at the time, and while Frank was being transported between jails, he was grabbed by a mob and lynched on August 17th, 1915. And again, it sort of highlighted the hostility felt at the time. This, of course, 1950 is the same year that saw the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. It sort of personified or showed the deep hostility towards immigrants, in this case of Jewish background, in America at that time. There were also larger factors at work, larger forces at work that led to greater hostility towards immigrants in the second and third centuries, the 1910s and 20s of the 20th century. One had to do with World War I. America's entry into the war led to a great deal of anti-German prejudice. Now, as we talked about before, many Americans saw Germans as the right kind of immigrants. But once we went to war with Germany, German immigrants came under great suspicion. But more broadly than that, German immigrants were seen as part of a foreign culture that was infiltrating America with anti-American ideas. Germany was an authoritarian state at the time, and many Americans sort of believed in becoming anti-German during the war, an idea promoted, of course, by the U.S. government's propaganda departments, which were trying to stir up, American patriotism by seeing the enemy in the worst possible light. But that this hostility towards Germany became kind of a larger hostility towards foreign ideas and foreign influences and foreign immigrants generally, so that World War I sort of contributed to the anti-immigrant climate of the late 1910s. Again, by the way, we can note once again, the sort of the idea of the German here represented in the crudest possible terms as a brutal guerrilla, represented, of course, threatening good white American womanhood, an image that we've seen in dealing with sort of in racist terms towards African Americans in the Reconstruction South, and of course in anti-Native American sentiment in the American West, and even afterwards in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Another issue that came up, of course, growing out of World War I was the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Communist Revolution of 1917. Many Americans associated this Bolshevik Communist Revolution with immigration from that very part of the world, from Russia and Eastern Europe. And so what began to many native-born Americans conflated was the idea of these radical, dangerous, anti-American ideologies like communism and Bolshevism with immigrants coming from that particular part of the world. And indeed, a small minority of immigrants were active in anarchist and communist political movements in the United States, but the vast majority of immigrants, of course, come to the United States to thrive in a capital society and accepted American free market ideas. But again, this kind of conflating of these radical ideologies and sort of equating them with being a foreigner from this part of the world. And so American hostility towards the Bolshevik Revolution and communism kind of spilled over into hostility towards foreigners and immigrants generally. And all of this hostility and prejudice towards immigrants and foreigners reaches a kind of political crescendo in the early 1920s with the passage of a couple of anti-immigration pieces of legislation, both of which, one in 1921 and 1924, were based on the idea of a quota system. And the quota system worked like this. Basically, what they did was they measured a certain population at a certain point in American history and determined how many people of that origin were living in the United States at that time, and then said, okay, we're going to have a quota. This percentage of people will be allowed in from that country, and based on how many of that people from that country were living in the United States at that time. The act in 1921 based the population of foreigners in the United States, their country of origin. It was based on levels in 1910. This, of course, was at a period of peak immigration. During the 1900s, of course, as this chart indicates, more than 8 million people came into the United States, many of them from Eastern and Southern Europe, and the quota was set at 3%. So, in other words, if there were 1 million persons of Italian descent living in the United States, then the quota for each year was set at 3%, so it would be the equivalent of 30,000. But of course, the Italian population in the United States in 1910 was much higher than that. It was in the millions upon millions by that point, because there had been 20, 30 years of massive immigration from Italy already, and so the quota was quite high. And after the 1921 Act, the Emergency Quota Act, as it was called, passed, many native-born Americans who were hostile to immigration decided that these numbers were too welcoming, that 3% based on 1910 population levels allowed too many of these immigrants coming in, the wrong kind of immigrants, the immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. So in 1924, the the Immigration Act was superseded by the Immigration Act of 1924, which set a quota of 2% based on the population levels in 1890, before much of the mass immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe had occurred. What this quota system did, in effect, was it blocked immigration from those places that many Americans had come to decide were not sources of the right kind of immigrants, Eastern and Southern European. And so they were largely blocked off from coming in, whereas there were already many people who in America in 1890 who were of British or German or French or Dutch origins, Scandinavian origins, places that Americans believed produced better immigrants. And so their immigration levels were allowed to continue. But of course, those countries tended to be more prosperous and produced less economic immigrants coming to the United States. And so the result, of course, of the 1924 Act can be seen in this chart, which shows a massive drop-off in immigration from 8 million, over 8 million in the 1900s to just 699,000 or less than 700,000 in the 1930s. But of course, a lot of that drop in immigration had to do with the great economic depression that hit the United States and much of the world in that decade. Now, of course, we live today in an era of massive immigration again, and that has to do with something that happened in 1965. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Immigration and Nationality Act. And the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 basically ended the old quota system and set an overall limit to immigration coming from the United States. And it also it made a priority for immigrants to reunite with their families. So family connections with people in the United States became a higher priority, what allowed people to legally immigrate to the United States. Now, at the time in 1965, many Americans and many policymakers, like Lyndon Johnson and the Congress that passed the act, believed that this was going to encourage European immigration because, most of the people in the United States were of European origin. They would reach back to their families. Many still had families living in Eastern and Southern Europe. And so the 1965 Act was seen that it wasn't really going to change things that much, that the immigration was kind of continued along the same path because most people in America were of European origin and they had family connections back to Europe, and so the immigration would come from Europe. But in fact, what happened was that Europeans didn't send that many immigrants after 1965. There were two reasons for this. One was that Eastern Europeans, of course, lived under the yoke of communism, and communist regimes in Eastern Europe and Russia did not allow their people to emigrate. And the other factor was that in Western Europe, places like Italy, Greece, and other countries that had sent large numbers of immigrants before, the post-World War II period, the 1960s, were a time of great economic advancements in those countries. The economies were prosperous, and so people didn't see the need to immigrate. Instead, what happened, as we know, is that the 1965 Act, by eliminating national quotas, opened up immigration from other parts of the world, from parts of the world that were undergoing economic change, that parts of the world that were now increasingly accessible to the United States through advancements in transportation and communication systems. And as the trickle of immigrants, which begins in the 1960s, as we can see from this chart, and then begins to grow and grow in the 1970s and 1980s, and grows into the flood that we know today, was basically kind of a snowballing effect, that as certain family members, certain people immigrating to the United States from Latin America and Asia and established themselves, they were able to bring family members over from their native countries. And so the level of immigration from places like Asia and Latin America, and also places like the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean, started to grow and grow, a process known as chain migration, where one person from a family or community comes over and then basically brings over others because either family connections where they were legally allowed to bring them, or because they communicate back to their home country and tell them about all these opportunities that are available in the new country. And so bringing other immigrants from their communities and their native lands and their families into America. And so that ends our discussion today of immigration and urbanization in late 19th and early 20th century America. Next week we will discuss the Progressive Era and the rise of liberal political ideology and its effects on American life in the last decade of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So I'll see you all on Monday. Thanks. Bye-bye.